Good evening. Rabbi Manny Viñas, speaking on behalf of El Centro de Estudios Judíos Torat Emet, the Center for Jewish Studies Torat Emet, a Spanish language, Jewish education and renewal program throughout the web, providing Jewish education for Latin American Jews and primarily concentrating on helping the descendants of Jews who were forcibly converted to Catholicism during the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions and who are now living throughout all of the lands in the dispersion in Latin America and who wish to return back to Judaism. I usually transmit in Spanish these classes, but I wanted to take a few moments to share with you my thoughts upon the death of the dictator of Cuba, Fidel Castro. The reason that I wanted to do so is because I am a Cuban Jew. I was blessed to grow up in the United States of America, and I grew up in a primarily Cuban-American community that we were all living in Miami because of the Cuban Revolution and the dictatorship that Fidel Castro brought to our wonderful country. You see, most of the people that I grew up with were Cuban Jews and Cuban non-Jews who had had to leave everything they owned in Cuba because of the Cuban Communist Revolution that had stolen all of their property, had stolen all of their human rights, had stolen even their ability to be able to redress their government, to be able to complain about all of the terrible changes that were occurring. My family had to leave Cuba with very little money in their pockets, had to come to the United States, and we're so blessed that we were formally educated, we owned our home, we lived our American dream, and we spoke English, and we became acculturated to the United States. But my friends, we never forgot all of the terrible suffering that the Cuban people were undergoing. We had constant contact with people in Cuba. We had many people who joined us in liberty in Miami. And today, as I walked into the synagogue this morning, it's right after Shabbat now, as I walked into the synagogue this morning, I received from some of my congregants the wonderful news of the passing of this ruthless dictator that I grew up hoping that someday I would be able to see the liberty of being able to see that his system, his regime, would someday give liberty to the Cuban people. And so I wanted to take a few moments to share with you my thoughts and my reactions at the passing of this terrible man. And of course, as I walked into the synagogue and I was told this, I was elated and shocked. And from my spirit came forth a verse which is very popular in the Haggadah for Passover. And I want to read you this verse because I believe that this Bible verse, this section from the Torah in Shemot, in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23 and 24, are not only speaking of the moment when the Pharaoh of Egypt died and the Jewish people cried out to God, but because it is also speaking of the reaction of the Cuban people on the occasion of the death of the Pharaoh of Cuba, who has oppressed us for far too long. I want to read you the verse. And it happened during those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel cried and groaned because of their work. And they cried out to God, and their outcry went up to God, and God heard their moaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so we see in this verse, Exodus chapter 2, verse 23 and 24, that the Jewish people cried out to God on the occasion of the death of Pharaoh. And our rabbis of blessed memory ask the question, why did they cry out on the death of Pharaoh? Why was it that at the death of Pharaoh, when they cried out and they moaned to God, that God heard their cries? Why did they cry? Why weren't they happy that Pharaoh had died? And of course, the response is a very powerful response according to our rabbis of blessed memory. And that is that they lived in such oppression that the Pharaoh of Egypt not only oppressed the Jewish people, but he also took away their ability to complain about the oppression. He had set up a state in Egypt that required that the slaves not only provide free labor for the state, and that the state was driving benefit from their labor and not sharing the profit of their labor. But not only that, and he oppressed them, and he took away all of their rights. But not only that, he also took away their right to be able to complain, to be able to groan, to be able to call out to their God. He took away their religious liberty. He took away their freedom of expression. He took away all of the things that make us human in a time of tremendous oppression. Fidel Castro did that also to the Cuban people. He took away our ability to redress our government. He took away our freedom of the press. His spies are all over the island of Cuba, controlling thought and speech. And so, just like when the Pharaoh of Egypt died, the Jewish people saw that it was an opportunity to cry publicly. They went out into the streets to bemoan the death of Pharaoh publicly, but knowing in their hearts that they were really crying out to God, asking God to bring them liberation from the many, many years of servitude, the many, many years of oppression. The Cuban people are also fed up with the oppression of the Castro brothers and their regime and their Marxist ideology and their one-party system that has taken away and does not recognize our basic human rights, our ability to have property rights, our ability to vote, our ability to express ourselves, our ability to raise our children and to pray however we see fit. And so we cry out to God in joy for the death of Fidel Castro. But the Jewish people also saw when Pharaoh had died that it wasn't the end of the oppression. That right after the death of Pharaoh, there would be another Pharaoh. And that Pharaoh would continue to oppress us. They had longed for so long for the moment when the Pharaoh would die, hoping that it would bring them liberation. And instead, alas, they saw that just as Pharaoh had died, another evil Pharaoh had arisen. The same exact thing is going on in Cuba today, folks. Fidel Castro has died, and before he died, he made sure that his brother Raúl, who was also a ruthless and heartless dictator, would take over our country and would oppress the people of Cuba, making them produce for a state, making them all slaves and serfs of the state, without sharing the blessings that come from their hard work. The people began to cry out. In the next few days, we're going to see the burial, the mourning for the death of Pharaoh, the Pharaoh of Cuba. And I want to join with all of my Cuban brothers and sisters in the celebration of the death of this terrible despot. But I also want to take a moment to cry out to God and to ask God to bring us liberation, not to allow the next Pharaoh, Raúl Castro, his brother, or any of the collaborators with that horrible regime to continue to oppress us. You know, friends, one of the ways that the sages of Israel understood the crying and the moaning of the Jewish people at the death of Pharaoh was that they realized that here was a man who had oppressed so many, but had lived out his life and had died of old age. Here was a man who was not worthy of life, but was given a life and died unmolested. Wouldn't it be right that the people of Cuba and the people in Egypt would have risen up against the Pharaoh, removed him from power, and taken the human rights that was due to them? Instead, here was a man who had lived out his life and who had died and quickly another Pharaoh ascended to the throne. I want to join in prayer, not only in celebration for the death of this horrible despot, but I also want to join in prayer that the next Pharaoh of Egypt that has been installed against the will of the Cuban people, against the will of everybody who loves liberty, that next Pharaoh does not live out a long reign of terror against us. I want to pray that this be a moment of change for Cuba, and that a true revolution come into Cuba. A true revolution, which is the revolution that Moses brought to the Jewish people, brought to the Hebrews when we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. That revolution that does not come from governments, that revolution that does not come from politicians, that revolution that comes from knowing the rightful and moral path of spirituality with the presence of God in our hearts. I want to join in prayer with the Cuban people to give thanks to God that we were finally able to see this great day of the death of that ruthless murderer. And I also want to join in prayer with them, asking God to make that the next Pharaoh should end very, very quickly, and that liberty come to all of the Cuban people, Jews, Christians, of all persuasions, that all of Cuba should be able to celebrate a true internal revolution, the revolution that comes from repentance. When you throw yourself in front of God, you ask Him to forgive your sins, and you beg Him to have mercy upon us. Friends, as a Cuban Jew, as soon as I heard the news of the death of Fidel Castro, my first thoughts, woe is me that I was not able to share this wonderful day with my mother of blessed memory. Woe is me that I was not able to celebrate this wonderful day with my great aunt, who cried at the moment of her death that she would be buried in a foreign land. All of us loved Cuba. All of us love this country and are grateful to this country, United States of America, for all of the wonderful blessings that it gave us. But we never forgot. We never forgot all of the terrible things that Fidel Castro has done to the Cuban people. And today, my heart is filled with joy, knowing that this evil despot can do us no more harm, that he is now in the hands of the Creator of heaven and earth, who is a just and loving God, but wants to apply justice. And I hope and pray that all of the dictators of the earth will come to a quick and timely end, so that human beings can prosper, so that human beings can contribute to one another. I pray that the Cuban people be blessed with love for one another, that the Cuban people will be blessed by the presence of God among us, within us, from the study of God's Bible, from the study of God's moral law, and that the Cuban people grow and prosper in democracy and in freedom to contribute our rightful place, a contribution to the rest of the world. And so I join my brothers and sisters, Cuba, my brothers and sisters all over the world who are celebrating liberty, who are celebrating the death of despots, who are celebrating the opportunity that comes with the death of the evil ones, for those who are innocent, who wish to live their lives in tranquility and in harmony, to be able to prosper for themselves and for their families. I thank you for listening to my thoughts, and I ask you to pray for the Cuban people and to pray for liberty for everyone all over the world. Shalom.